October 19, 1943, the Apennine Mountains, 15 kilometers east of Bologna, Italy, 2:17 in the morning. The farmhouse at the edge of the hamlet of Monterenzio sits in complete darkness. No lamp in the window, no smoke from the chimney, not because the family has gone to sleep, but because they are terrified that any sign of warmth, any trace of habitation, might draw attention from the road below. In the hayloft above the stone barn, 5 men lie motionless in the dark. They have not moved in 4 hours. They are filthy. 2 of them have open wounds on their feet, skin split from 2 weeks of walking through mountain terrain in boots 2 sizes too small, scavenged from a dead Italian soldier. They smell of wet wool and dried blood and the particular sharp stench of men who have been afraid for a very long time. Their names are Lance Corporal George Furlong of the Royal Irish Fusiliers, Private Thomas Meredith of the 2nd South African Infantry, 2 New Zealanders, brothers, in fact, Sergeant Dennis Carr and Private Alan Carr, 27th New Zealand Machine Gun Battalion, and Corporal James Whitfield, Royal Engineers, who has barely spoken a word since the armistice 6 weeks ago, turned his world upside down. They had been prisoners of war. Now they were something harder to define. When Italy surrendered to the Allies on September 8th, when the news crackled through the radio at Campo PG-19 near Bologna, and the Italian guard simply walked away, some of them weeping, some shaking hands with the men they had been guarding for 18 months. The 5 of them had walked into the Italian countryside with 37 other men and the fragile belief that they might actually go home. Most of the 37 had been recaptured within days. These 5 had not yet. Now they hear it, boots on the gravel path below, a vehicle, headlights cutting across the ceiling slats of the hayloft in thin yellow lines, the creak of a car door, a voice, male, sharp, giving an order in German. George Furlong reaches across the hay and grips Thomas Meredith's arm without a word. Neither of them breathes. The boots stop at the farmhouse door. A fist hammers the wood 3 times. A woman's voice answers, Signora Elena Zucchini, 54 years old, who has been hiding these men for 9 days, feeding them from her own kitchen at the risk of her life. Her voice is calm, practiced. She has done this before. The door opens, more voices. The beam of a torch sweeps across the farmyard, and then silence. A long, terrible pause. And then the voice of a German officer, calm and deliberate, speaking words that none of the 5 men in the hayloft can fully understand. They hear the farmhouse door close, the boots retreat. The vehicle pulls away. The 5 men wait 2 more hours before they dare to move. Only later, days later, when they are safe, will they discover what the officer actually said to Signora Zucchini at the door. He told her, "There is nothing here. We were never here. Do you understand me?" His name was Hauptmann Franz Josef Becker. He was 32 years old. He wore the uniform of the German Wehrmacht. He was on paper a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party. And he would spend the next 14 months doing one of the most dangerous things a man in occupied Italy could do, saving the lives of his country's enemies. To understand Franz Becker, to understand why he would stand at that farmhouse door in the dark and choose a lie that could get him shot, you have to understand where he came from. He was born on November 12, 1910, in Innsbruck, in the old Austrian Tyrol, the second son of a school teacher and a seamstress. His father, Wilhelm Becker, taught German literature and history at a gymnasium, a secondary school, and ran his household with the quiet seriousness of a man who believed that books and principles could outlast any political system. His mother, Katharina, was a devout Catholic who lit candles for the dead every Sunday without fail. Innsbruck in those years was a city caught between worlds. The Habsburg Empire had only collapsed in 1918, when Franz was 7, and the Austrians were still navigating what it meant to exist as a small republic in the rubble of a great power. There was poverty. there was wounded national pride, and there was, drifting in from the north, a new and ugly politics that promised a cure for all of it. Franz Becker, by every account that can be reconstructed, was not drawn to that politics. He was, by temperament, his father's son, a reader, a thinker, a man who absorbed the complexity of the world rather than demanding it be simplified. He enrolled at the University of Innsbruck in 1929 to study law. He was, by the accounts of classmates, meticulous, quietly funny, and genuinely principled. It was at university that he met David Weiss. David Weiss was a Jewish student from Vienna, 2 years older than Franz, studying the same program, and possessed of a sharp wit and a sharper legal mind. The two men became, in the way of young men who find they understand each other immediately, close friends. They argued about Kant over coffee. They debated the rise of National Socialism in Germany with the half-fearful, half-contemptuous certainty of young men who believed that nothing so crude could actually prevail. They were wrong about that, as it turned out. Franz graduated in 1933, the same year Adolf Hitler came to power across the border. He began working as a junior legal clerk for a firm in Innsbruck. He watched, over the next 5 years, as the political atmosphere in Austria curdled, as the Nazi ideology spread from Germany like gas through a building with bad ventilation, finding every crack and corner. He watched David Weiss lose his position at the firm where he'd begun practicing law. He watched men he'd grown up with parade through the streets wearing the swastika. He said nothing publicly. That was its own kind of failure, and he likely knew it. On March 12, 1938, the Anschluss, German troops crossed into Austria, and the country ceased to exist as an independent state. Austria became the Ostmark, a province of the German Reich. Every institution, every organization, every career path was absorbed overnight into the Nazi apparatus. Franz Becker, who had joined the Austrian Army's Reserve Officer Corps in 1935, found himself automatically inducted into the Wehrmacht. He was offered a choice that was, in truth, no choice at all: join the Nazi Party and continue his commission, or resign and face the grinding uncertainty of a blacklist. He joined the party. He kept the uniform. He never saw David Weiss again. What happened to Weiss is unknown. That unknowing, that absence, that particular quality of dread that settles in the stomach when you realize you never said goodbye to someone who then simply disappeared, almost certainly never left Franz Becker. It may in fact have been the thing that saved the lives of dozens of men who never knew his name. He served in the Polish campaign in September 1939. He served on the Eastern Front in 1941 and 1942 with Army Group South, enduring the brutal Russian winters and the grinding, horrifying nature of that particular war. He was wounded twice, once at Kharkov in May 1942, once more in January. 1943. In October 1943, still recovering from his second wound, he was assigned to rear area security duties with Army Group C in Italy. He could not have known when he received those orders that he was about to step into the most important 14 months of his life. Italy in the autumn of 1943 was a country that had been split in two, not just geographically, but spiritually. On September 8th, when the Italian government announced its armistice with the Allies, the effect was something close to total dissolution. By August of that year, the International Red Cross had registered over 84,000 Allied prisoners of war in Italian camps, British, Commonwealth, and American soldiers, sailors, and airmen captured mostly in North Africa or the skies over the Mediterranean. In a single night, the guards who had been watching over them simply melted away. The camps, dozens of them scattered across Italy, from the heel of the boot to the Po Valley, opened, or were simply abandoned. Thousands of men walked out into the Italian countryside, blinking in the September sunlight in the strange and terrifying position of being free and utterly stranded at the same time. They had three options: head south toward the Allied front lines, which everyone believed would arrive any day; head north toward neutral Switzerland and the Alps, or stay hidden in the countryside and wait. The Allied advance did not arrive any day. The Germans had anticipated the Italian betrayal. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding Army Group C, one of the most gifted defensive commanders of the war, had already moved German divisions into northern and central Italy well before the armistice. Within days of September 8th, German forces had disarmed the Italian army, seized key infrastructure, and established a defensive architecture that would hold the Allies at bay for nearly 2 more years. The front line stabilized far to the south, at the winter line, around Cassino and the Sangro River. It would not move significantly until May 1944. For the thousands of Allied soldiers now loose in the Italian countryside, that meant months of desperate evasion in a country under German military occupation. German orders regarding escaped Allied prisoners were clear and brutal. Recapture was mandatory. Italians who assisted escapees faced execution. Escaped POWs who resisted recapture could be shot on sight. It was into this world that Franz Becker arrived in October 1943, assigned to a Wehrmacht rear area security formation operating in the Apennine foothills south of Bologna. His formal role was to oversee the processing and transfer of recaptured Allied POWs, logging their identities, verifying their military status, and arranging their transport north to permanent camps in Germany. It was, on paper, an administrative role. In practice, it made him a gatekeeper between the escaped men and the machinery that would grind them up. The unit he served in, we will call it the 4th Company, 741st Landesschützen Battalion, a rear area security formation typical of those deployed in occupied Italy, was not a frontline combat unit. It was composed of older men, many of them veterans of the First World War, assigned to patrol duties, supply route security, and camp administration. They were not, by and large, the fanatical true believers of the SS. Many of them were simply men doing a job, trying not to think too hard about what the job meant. Becker noted this. He noted other things, too. He noted the condition of the recaptured men who came through his processing point, British soldiers from places like Glasgow and Cardiff and Johannesburg and Christchurch, thin and frightened and trying to maintain their dignity in circumstances that stripped it away. He noted the faces of the Italian farm families who were brought in for questioning after they were found sheltering escapees, elderly women, farmers, teenagers, and the particular flatness of fear that had replaced expression in their eyes. And he began, perhaps, to hear the echo of a question he had been refusing to ask since 1938. The Apennine autumn was brutal. The mountains closed around the valleys like a fist. Rain came horizontal off the ridges and turned the dirt roads to mud. The smell in the hills was of wood smoke and wet stone, and in the weeks after the armistice, the indefinable smell of something ruined, an old order, an old world, dissolving in the rain. Becker's unit began receiving increasingly specific orders about how to handle escaped Allied prisoners. The language hardened. The instructions became less about the Geneva Convention and more about operational efficiency. There were, by late 1943, German commands in Italy that were executing escaped Allied POWs, particularly those associated with or suspected of joining partisan groups. He saw the orders. He read them in the lamplight of a commandeered Italian farmhouse, and he sat with them for what, by his own reckoning, must have been a very long time. Then he went to work. It began, as these things sometimes do, with a single act. The first man Franz Becker saved was not a dramatic rescue. There was no midnight run through the hills. There was no gunfire. There was a clipboard, a pen, and a deliberate mark on a piece of paper. November 3rd, 1943. His unit had recaptured a British corporal, a man named Walter Hewitt from Birmingham, 2nd Battalion Royal Fusiliers, near the village of Castel San Pietro, about 12 kilometers east of Bologna. Hewitt had been loose for nearly 2 months, surviving on food stolen from farms and the charity of a family in the village of Ozzano dell'Emilia, who had hidden him in a root cellar. He was brought to Becker's processing point, a commandeered granary on the edge of Monterenzio, thin, limping, his British battle dress reduced to something barely recognizable as a uniform. Becker's orders were clear: process the prisoner, log the capture, arrange transport north. Becker processed him. He logged the capture. And then, in the column marked transferred to Stalag 7A Moosburg, a camp in Bavaria, he wrote the man's name and numbers. Walter Hewitt was never sent to Stalag 7A. That night, Becker walked to the back of the granary, unlocked the door to the storage room where Hewitt was being held, and stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at the man on the floor. "Do you speak German?" Becker asked. Hewitt looked up. "No," he said. "A little French?" "A little French will do," Becker said. He set down a small sack. Inside it, bread, hard cheese, and a folded piece of paper. "There is a map, not a military map, a rough one. The village to the south, Loiano. There is a woman there. She knows who to contact. Tell her Heinrich sent you. Do you understand?" Hewitt stared at him. "Who the hell are you?" Becker looked at the wall behind the man's head for a moment. "No one," he said. "I am a filing error." He left. He closed the door. He left it unlocked. By morning, Walter Hewitt was gone. That was the first. Over the following weeks, Becker developed a system. It was not elegant. It couldn't be. But it had an internal logic built from a lawyer's precision and a survivor's caution. When recaptured Allied POWs came through his processing point, Becker assessed 2 things: their physical condition and whether they could credibly be transferred. For men who were badly wounded or who had already been seen by too many other German soldiers, he had no choice but to process them legitimately. Those men went north to Germany. That haunted him, by all subsequent indication, those names in the legitimate column of his ledger. But for men who had been brought in by smaller patrols, by 2 or 3 soldiers who had found a stray in a barn or a ditch, he had more room to maneuver. These men he would log as transferred. But the transfer never left his processing point. He had help. Her name was Sophia Morelli. She was 31 years old, a teacher's widow whose husband had been killed. Fighting in North Africa, fighting, as it happened, against the very British and Commonwealth soldiers Becker was now helping to escape. She had taken over the management of her late husband's small farm outside Monterenzio, and she had, in the chaotic weeks after the armistice, made a decision that many Italians in those hills made, that the men wandering through her fields with hollow eyes and British accents were not the enemy anymore. The connection between Becker and Morelli was made through an Italian farmer named Angelo Zucchini, the son of Signora Elena Zucchini, the woman at the door on the night we began this story. Angelo was a partisan contact, not a fighter exactly, but part of the informal network that was moving escaped Allied prisoners toward the Gothic line or toward the Swiss border. He had been watching Becker's processing point and the men who came out of it, and he had begun to notice something odd. The numbers didn't always add up. Men were registered as transferred, but no trucks had come. He found a way to speak to Becker through an intermediary, a Catholic priest in Monterenzio, who had decided that God's law outranked the Reich's. The first conversation between Becker and Morelli, by necessity, took place through the priest's translation. It was brief. Becker told her that he could produce men in small groups, never more than 3 at a time, at a designated point near the road. To Loiano, he could give them papers forged well enough to pass a casual check. He needed to know they would be moved quickly, and that no one would ever connect them to his name. Morelli agreed. Later, in post-war testimony that would lie forgotten in an archive for decades, she described that first meeting with characteristic flatness. He did not talk about morality or God. He talked like a lawyer going through contract terms. I thought, this man will not panic. That is what we need. Over the next 10 months, the system functioned. The scale was not enormous by the metrics of grand historical gestures, but in the hills south of Bologna, in the particular darkness of that particular occupation, each individual act had the weight of an entire world. January 1944. A group of 5 South Africans, captured during the fighting around Cassino, sent north for processing, routed through Becker's Point by a Wehrmacht sergeant who couldn't be bothered to drive further in the ice, walked out of the granary storage room 2 nights after their arrival with bread, false papers identifying them as Italian agricultural laborers, and a hand-drawn map pointing toward a farmhouse near the village of Pianoro. March 1944. 3 American airmen, a B-17 Flying Fortress crew shot down near Ferrara, arrived at the processing point after a week of evasion. They were not officially registered. Their capture was not logged. Becker told the patrol sergeant that the men had been handed to a Gestapo unit operating in the valley. The sergeant, who wanted nothing to do with the Gestapo, asked no further questions. The 3 Americans were at the Swiss border in 16 days, April 1944. A British major, a man named Cartwright from the 56th London Division, who had been loose since the previous September, was brought in almost as an afterthought, a footnote to a larger patrol action. He was in terrible condition, a deep infection in one leg, a fever that had him barely coherent. Becker sent for a doctor, the Italian doctor who served the village, Dr. Aldo Ferretti, who was already in Morelli's network, and spent 3 days making sure the man would live before he moved him. Cartwright remembered very little of those days. He remembered a German officer who came each evening and sat in the corner of the room without speaking, and who left without explanation on the 4th night. The major made it to Allied lines in June 1944. By Becker's own estimate, made in a letter that, if it exists, has never been publicly located, he helped approximately 47 men reach safety between November 1943 and September 1944. British soldiers, South Africans, New Zealanders, Australians, Americans. A handful of Canadian airmen whose aircraft had gone down over the Po Valley. 47 men is not the scale of Schindler. It is not a round number for a monument. But consider what 47 men means. Consider 47 specific futures. Marriages, children, grandfathers, ordinary Tuesdays. Consider 47 men who came home when they might not have. That is not nothing. That is not nothing at all. The summer of 1944 changed everything about the mathematics of survival in northern Italy. In June, Rome fell to the Allies. The German line retreated north. Kesselring established the Gothic Line, a massive defensive fortification stretching across the Apennines from coast to coast, designed to hold northern Italy indefinitely. And the war settled into a new, grinding phase. The terrain was ideal for German defense: steep ridges, narrow valleys, limited road access. The Allied advance slowed to a crawl. For Franz Becker, the summer brought something else: scrutiny. The German military apparatus in Italy, by the second half of 1944, was tightening. The Feldgendarmerie, the military police called Kettenhunde, chain dogs, by German soldiers for the gorget plates they wore around their necks, had been tasked with investigating inconsistencies in rear area security operations. There had been reports of Allied escapees in the Monterenzio sector whose documented transfers to Germany could not be verified at the receiving camps in Bavaria. The discrepancies were small, the kind of thing that, in the chaos of a war going badly, might easily go unnoticed. A figure here, a name unverified there. In August 1944, an Oberfeldwebel, a senior NCO named Hartmann, attached to the Feldgendarmerie, arrived at Becker's processing point for what was described as a routine records review. Becker had been waiting for something like this. He was, after all, a lawyer by training. He had built his records with a lawyer's care for plausible deniability. The discrepancies were present, but they were buried in genuine administrative confusion, routed through unit transfers and supply chain irregularities that were endemic to the Wehrmacht by 1944. To prove fraud, Hartmann would need to untangle months of paperwork across multiple commands. Hartmann spent 2 days reviewing records. He found 3 files he could not immediately reconcile. He told Becker he would be returning. On the night Hartmann left, Becker went to Sophia Morelli's farm and told her the system was temporarily suspended. He burned 3 coded notebooks in her hearth. He moved 2 Allied soldiers, a British sergeant and a New Zealand corporal, who were being sheltered at the farm, immediately before the suspension took effect. He told Morelli only one thing beyond the operational update. "If I am arrested, you do not know me. You have never heard my name. You found those men in the barn when you arrived one morning, and they were already gone when you came back. That is all you know." Morelli told post-war investigators that she had asked him that night why he had ever started, that she had wanted to understand, after all those months, what the actual reason was. He was quiet for a long time, she said. Then he said, "I had a friend in Innsbruck. He was Jewish. After 1938, he disappeared. I spent a long time telling myself I didn't know what had happened to him. I think I did know. I think I had always known." He stood up. He put on his coat. "I told myself at the time that there was nothing I could do. I have been proving to myself for the past year that this was a lie." He walked out of the farmhouse into the Italian night. It was the last time Morelli saw him. Franz Becker was summoned to appear before a military tribunal in Bologna on February 14, 1945. The charges, if they were formally charges at this point rather than a preliminary inquiry, related to administrative irregularities in prisoner-of-war processing records from the period October 1943 to September 1944. The Feldgendarmerie investigation had, apparently, progressed further than Becker had hoped. He was scheduled to appear at 9 o'clock in the morning. He was last confirmed seen by a fellow officer, a lieutenant named Gruber, serving at the same post, on the evening of February 13th. Gruber later told Allied investigators that Becker had seemed calm, that he had eaten dinner with the other officers, that he had made a dry joke about the wine, that he had gone to bed at a normal hour. By 6 a.m. on February 14th, he was gone. His bunk was made. His service pistol was in its holster on the hook by the door. He had left it behind deliberately, which Gruber later said struck him as a significant detail. His identification documents were gone. One change of civilian clothes was missing from his locker, a small amount of Reichsmarks. That was it. The tribunal convened without him. He was declared absent without leave. In April 1945, when Army Group C surrendered to the Allies, all outstanding Wehrmacht courts-martial were effectively suspended. In the post-war denazification proceedings, a file was opened on Franz Josef Becker, Hauptmann, Wehrmacht serial number unknown, Austrian national, born Innsbruck, 1910. The file was never closed for the simple reason that the man could not be found. What happened to him? Here the historical record becomes unavoidably a collection of competing possibilities. And this is worth being honest about, rather than pretending to a certainty we don't have. Theory 1. He died. The final months of the war in northern Italy were extraordinarily violent and chaotic. Bologna itself fell to the Allies only on April the 21st, 1945, just 2 weeks before Germany's final surrender. A man on the run in civilian clothes in that environment, with no papers and no network to protect him, could easily have been killed by Allied fire, by partisan reprisals, by the general entropy of a collapsing military occupation. Several German officers in Italy died in exactly this way in early 1945, their deaths unrecorded and unlocated. Theory 2. He emigrated. The post-war rat lines The networks that helped former Nazis escape to South America and elsewhere were primarily designed for SS officers and committed war criminals. But there were others who used the same infrastructure for different reasons, men who feared denazification, men who simply wanted to disappear. An Austrian officer with a lawyer's mind and a year of practice at false documentation might have made it to Genoa, and then to a ship, and then to Argentina or Brazil or Chile, where he might have lived out a quiet, anonymous life under a name nobody knew. Theory 3. He was protected. The OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence agency, was actively operating in northern Italy in 1944 to 45, running agents through Switzerland and building networks throughout the German-occupied zone. Alan Dulles, the OSS station chief in Bern, was recruiting German sources in Italy throughout this period. It is not inconceivable that a Wehrmacht officer who had been systematically helping Allied prisoners escape, and who, crucially, had detailed knowledge of German rear-area security operations in the Bologna sector, would have been of significant interest to Allied intelligence. Several German officers who cooperated with the OSS in this period received new identities and quiet post-war resettlement as part of the bargain. We do not know which of these is true. We may never know. What we do know is this. In the months after the war, as the Allied Screening Commission processed testimonies from returned Allied escapees, a recurring figure appeared in the accounts. A German officer, described variously as Austrian, as a captain, as a man with a formal manner and an unexpectedly calm demeanor, who had intervened at critical moments, who had given food or directions or simply looked away, whose name no one knew because he had always declined to give it. The Screening Commission investigators, overwhelmed with work, assigned the various accounts the status unverified, benefactor identity unknown. The file went into a box. The box went into an archive. It is still there. What do we do with a story like this? It would be easy, and wrong, to use Franz Becker as a redemption narrative for the German military. It would be easy to hold him up as proof that somewhere beneath the Wehrmacht uniform, ordinary human decency survived, that the system could be beaten from within, that good men were everywhere, if only you knew where to look. This would be a misreading, and it would be an insult to the dead. The hard truth about the German military in Italy, the Wehrmacht, not just the SS, is that it was an instrument of occupation and terror. The same Apennine valleys where Becker moved quietly through the night, helping men to safety, were also the valleys where, in the autumn of 1944, the 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division would murder at least 770 Italian civilians, men, women, and children, in the Montesole area near Marzabotto. The youngest victim was less than a year old. The soldiers who committed that massacre were also products of the same system that produced Franz Becker. They wore variations of the same uniform. The difference was not the uniform. The difference was a choice, a particular, specific, costly choice that most people in a given situation do not make. This is the thing that makes Franz Becker's story important, not that he was secretly good or secretly different, or that the Third Reich secretly contained men of conscience who would have done the right thing if only given the chance. He was given every chance not to do the right thing. He was given, in fact, every institutional incentive to do exactly the wrong thing. The party membership, the uniform, the orders, the threat of punishment, the administrative machinery that would cover his inaction with paperwork and procedure. He chose not to use any of it as a shield. Consider what that actually cost. He knew from the moment Walter Hewitt walked out of that granary in November 1943 that he was committing an offense that could see him shot. As an officer who had taken an oath to Adolf Hitler, falsifying military records and facilitating the escape of enemy prisoners of war was, by the laws under which he served, treasonous. The German military executed men for less. He had seen the orders about recaptured escapees. He knew what the Feldgendarmerie could do. He did it anyway, month after month, winter, spring, summer, 47 times by his own count. Each time he sat down with a clipboard and wrote a false name in a false column, he was making the same choice again. It was not a single dramatic decision. It was a daily recommitment to something he had decided alone, in the dark, was worth the risk. This is, in some ways, the most important thing to understand about moral courage. It is not a one-time event. It is a practice. It is the mundane, unglamorous, exhausting discipline of continuing to make the right choice when you have every reason to stop. And there is something else. Franz Becker almost certainly knew that his actions would never be publicly recognized. He could not announce what he was doing. He could not seek credit for it, or safety in exchange for it, or any form of acknowledgement at all. The men he helped escape didn't know his name. The Italian partisans who worked with him knew him only as Heinrich, a code name he had chosen, possibly for the same reason all of us sometimes name our inner selves after someone we have lost. He did it without any expectation of being remembered. He wasn't wrong about that. History, in its broad sweeps, forgot him, or never knew him in the first place. His name appears in no official archive as a hero. He received no medal, no recognition, no Yad Vashem designation. The Allied soldiers he saved went home and grew old and died, and most of them never knew the full story of the night. Someone didn't turn them in. There is a particular kind of courage that operates entirely without an audience. That is, perhaps the purest kind. History is full of named monsters. It is also full of unnamed saints, ordinary people, who made extraordinary choices in extraordinary times and then simply vanished back into the anonymous texture of the world, leaving behind only the living evidence of their choices. The men who made it home, the children born, the grandchildren, the Tuesday mornings that continued to happen because someone once, in the dark, chose to lie. Sergeant Dennis Carr, one of the 5 men in the hayloft that October night in 1943, made it back to New Zealand in early 1944. He married a woman named Irene. They had 4 children. He spent 30 years teaching mathematics at a secondary school in Christchurch. He died in 1987. His brother Alan made it home too. George Furlong, the Irish fusilier who had gripped Meredith's arm in the dark, returned to Belfast in March 1944. He worked as a bus driver for the rest of his working life. He never spoke much about the war. Thomas Meredith of the 2nd South African Infantry survived and returned to Cape Town. He became a dentist. Corporal James Whitfield, the Royal Engineer who hadn't spoken much, eventually did. He became a lay preacher. In a memoir published privately in 1971 for his family, he described the night in the farmhouse with a precision that suggests it never fully left him. A German officer came to the door. I heard him speaking. I heard the woman answer. I heard his boots on the gravel going away. I never knew what he said to her. I still don't know. I just know that he said whatever he said, and then he walked away, and we were still alive in the morning. Sophia Morelli lived on her farm outside Monterencio until 1991. She was 79 when she died. She gave testimony to an Italian war memorial organization in 1980 about the events of 1943 and 1944, and she was specific. She named no names. She said only that she had been helped by a German officer whose name I will not say, because I promised him I wouldn't. When the interviewer pressed her, she said, "He made his choice. He has the right to keep it private." She kept her promise to a man she had no reason to love and every reason to distrust. That, too, is a kind of courage. We live in a time that loves its history in clean lines. Heroes and villains, clear causes, unambiguous verdicts. The story of Franz Becker offers none of that. He was a man who wore a uniform and carried a party card that represented one of history's greatest evils. He was also a man who spent 14 months of that same history quietly, systematically, at enormous personal risk, pushing back against it. Both of these things are true at the same time. He was not a saint. He was not absolved of everything the uniform represented simply by what he did inside it. He was a human being, which means he was complicated and limited, and probably afraid more often than not, and probably also more capable of rationalizing inaction than he would ever admit. But he didn't rationalize. Not entirely. Not when it came to those 47 men. Somewhere in Italy, in the hills south of Bologna, or in a village whose name we don't know, or at the edge of a road on a cold morning in February, 1945, Franz Josef Becker made a decision and then disappeared. The historical record closes its door on him, and it stays closed. We are left with only what he left behind, 47 men, and the particular stubborn, irreducible fact that in the darkest history of the 20th century, in the machinery of a state built on death and obedience and the careful engineering of human cruelty, one man sat down with a clipboard and a pen and chose, over and over again, to write a different story. He vanished without a trace. But the trace was never supposed to be in the records. It was in the men who came home